Welcome to Change Policy. I'm Charlene.
I'm Crispin.
And in the last episode, we touched on the media, and then we also touched on what is left and right. So from my perspective, I think for a lot of people's perspective, is that, you mentioned that in the political, there's a political spectrum essentially for left and right, and at both extremes they somehow meet in the middle, and it's become more central to capture either end. But then you also mentioned that it's actually not appropriate for nowadays. Like, you don't see it. You see this, I guess, the speech analogy is fracturing. Can you explain more about what you're referring to?
Yeah, so traditionally you have the left-right divide at the far end of the right spectrum, without getting into kind of any sort of radical right. I mean, like, you have your absolute free market economy, absolute libertarian kind of ideals, absolute enlightenment, whatever, and basically no restrictions on capital, right? At the far other end, you've got total control over the means of production and capital, absolute redistribution of all income, and then basically everyone's sitting somewhere along that spectrum between individual freedom and collective control, right? And so, you have your sort of center left, which is where a lot of people were, and then a center right, a lot of people were, and you can sort of see it as a nice sort of bell deviation. You're more the data scientist than me, and the vast bulk of the people in that bell, right? So I think that paradigm has shifted. That it's much better to divide people up based on aspects of their value system, right? So, for example, there is the economic left and the economic right, okay? And there is the cultural left and the cultural right. So let's just do that simply to start with. So economic left would be progressive taxation, workers' rights, access to healthcare, access to education, access to childcare, dental services, compulsory retirement savings, that sort of thing. And then, so very much, and it's sort of a redistribution of tax policy. And potentially also UBI, which we can talk to, universal basic income, which is a new thing. And then economic right, which is free movement of capital, low taxes, absolute individual choice when it comes to healthcare, school choice, and all of that sort of stuff. So the sort of opposite of that. And so you can divide people into those two groups. And then you've got a cultural divide, which I think is where the cultural war is a real thing, where you've got on the left side, basically attacking our colonial history. So if we're in the West, attacking the British Empire, or attacking, racism in the past, or racism today, or trans issues, or gay rights. There's sort of social left of like, attacking big business and promoting individual kind of individual values-based issues, right? And then on the right, it's kind of the opposite of that, preserving traditional Judeo-Christian ideals, or at least acknowledging them, preserving our colonial contributions, and in particular, holding up the values of the Enlightenment, so sovereignty of the individual, scientific method, that sort of thing, right? So, and people can be split in any different of those four quadrants, for sure. So, and then you've got the sort of authoritarian and libertarian, so the role of the state, okay, which we'll come to. So, and I'll plant a flag here. I'm economically left and I'm culturally right, basically, right? So, and so I was your traditional center-left voter for the longest period of my life, right? Because I believe in, it's better for the society as a whole, and extends opportunity if people have, if they get sick, access to healthcare. And that if that requires progressive taxation in order to fund such a thing, then so much the better, right? Access to education, I think education is the single greatest investment that anyone could ever make. although the education system's a little bit twisted now. But historically, in terms of being able to preserve social mobility, the thing that's going to turn someone from someone of a low income background to a high income earner is education. If you become a doctor, you're going to earn a lot more money, and you're going to make a social contribution. So those are things that I really valued. Compulsory retirement savings to take the burden off, the pension system, but a pension safety net for those people that retire without that privilege. A social safety net in terms of workers' rights. If you lose your job, access to retraining and so on, and to push back into the workplace in a controlled way. Minimum wage, yeah. So all of those things I have firmly believed in. At the same time, I believe absolutely in the sovereignty of the individual, right? Freedom of speech is probably my most right-wing kind of position, which is I'm a free speech absolutist, and I've talked about why I think it's essential to personhood. Scientific method. There's no other ways of knowing, right? There is the scientific method, which is having a hypothesis, using data, falsifiable, replicatable, and totally independently verifiable, right?
I think social science is a bit fluffy though.
Well, yeah. So and also and then more controversially, I tend to be sympathetic towards the colonial past. Now, that's not to say that it's perfect, right? Or that various Indigenous groups don't have absolutely legitimate grievances and so on. Like, it's not an either or. But by and large, the British Empire, for example, ended slavery worldwide, right? It was courtesy of the British Navy. And people have to understand that prior to that, slavery was a universal norm across all of human civilization for thousands of years. It was so entrenched that it was entirely anodyne to think of it as part of human nature, the slavery, that people could own other people, right? But the British Navy put an end to that. Wouldn't have happened without the British Empire. We would have slavery today, no question, right? The vaccine, right? Smallpox, polio, measles, right? Things that just wiped out entire populations of people, courtesy of the Enlightenment period and a man called Edward Jenner. It's all like, it should be a household name. He saved more people than anyone else combined over the course of human history. Invented the vaccine, right? This would not have happened without scientific inquiry brought about by the Neoplatonist Enlightenment. Traditional philosophy, drama, mathematics from the ancient Greeks, and the rejuvenation of that in the Renaissance. I'm a big fan of Western civilization, and I'm not a cultural relativist. I do think we have a superior civilization to Saudi Arabia. Maybe that makes me a bigot, but I don't think it does, right? And that so I have a right-leaning cultural set of values, right? But I am absolutely left-leaning in terms of extending opportunity to all people. Right? But there are people that could be the total opposite of me, right? In that spectrum, you can be absolutely left-leaning in terms of your culture. So say, we believe only in the black armband of history, where the white colonialists decimated everyone in the world and brought misery around the earth and disease and genocide and Holocaust and all this sort of stuff. And that Western civilization kind of supplanted the cultural traditions of everywhere it went, and destroyed diversity and in its history, and was this scourge that basically enslaved everybody else to service the empires. And that's a view that people have, for sure. And we're seeing it playing out right now, across different parts of the world. But they can also be, with that, extraordinarily right-leaning in terms of economics. They can have that view and say, look, taxes are bad, and income should be distributed to whoever is the most productive kind of members of society. And I would put a lot of companies in this category at the moment, actually. So Disney wouldn't want, or Google or Facebook wouldn't want massive restrictions on their economic, but are quite happy to evangelize in these spaces in terms of social space. So, and that's why one of my criticisms of tech censorship, which I mentioned in an earlier episode, is that this alliance is temporary, people. Like if you happen to be left leaning on your cultural stuff, don't think that's not going to change when the interests of these tech giants change. Right, this is a temporary alliance you have. So don't allow tech censorship just because they're pushing a line that supports your current point of view, because in the future,
change,
in the future, they will use those same tools, those same allowances to crush your particular point of view. Absolutely, guaranteed. Not a little bit, definitely. Anyway, so that's just one sort of quadrant divide. Then you've got the attitude towards of state power, which is kind of another axis, which is what is the role of government in individual people's lives, right? So you can believe in universal education, universal healthcare, and so on, and that will kind of lean you towards more government power in that space. But then you might not want government intervention in a cultural space, right? You may think that this should come down, and we're seeing this on both sides, right? So, for example, a lot of the people that are pushing the kind of left-leaning cultural narrative, you've got people who, on the one hand, are saying, look, we want government to legislate to prevent any kind of hate speech and or legislate, revision to history books and things like that, or tearing down of statues, all that sort of stuff. And then there are people that are doing this on their own, right? That don't want the government to be involved. They're either seceding or they are breaking up police forces. They're getting they're trying to rebuild the relationship between the individual and the state from the ground up, based upon this left-leaning value. So where you sit in terms of the government's relationship to the individual is actually really is another axis on which the people are a spectrum. So if you have these kind of, like, I'll give you a personal example. I am not a libertarian, despite being despite being a free speech absolutist. I think that is, no compromise basically there almost. Oh, hello. Good. Let's see. We'll probably leave that in. We've got guests coming past in the studio. So, I'm not a libertarian because I am a left person on certain economic issues. Like, so for example,
universal basic income.
Well, universal, I mean, that's a whole topic. We'll discuss it. But the example I was going to use, much simpler, is a speed limit on the road, right?
Yes.
Ideally, we wouldn't have speed limits, like we would just be able to drive however fast we want. But then a lot of people would die, okay? And, that's just not worth it. Like, I'm willing to sacrifice that individual bit of liberty to drive at a speed so as that the worst driver on the road doesn't kill someone, right? Like that's a trade-off that I'm making for the broader community good. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's anti-libertarian. Libertarian would be, no, it's your individual choice. If you choose to drink and drive and you kill someone, then that's your responsibility. Well, yeah, but the person who's killed didn't choose that, and you didn't choose to do that willingly. You just didn't foresee the consequence, right? And so I think libertarianism has limits, that we should be free to do what we want unless there is a compelling reason for the benefit of society not to do that. And I think a speed limit is a very simple example, but also a very compelling one, right? As to why, you do need certain rules and norms that everyone abides by, even if it's only playing to the lowest common denominator, right?
Now I'm just thinking of like someone driving 100 kilometers an hour through a school zone. I'm just like, no.
Yeah, and a libertarian would say it's irresponsible to do that, and they should be held accountable for the injury and harm that they cause as a consequence of doing that. Whereas it would be better if there was prevented from doing that. By social sanction if need be. And so but there are people who disagree with that, who think, no, it's all about individual choice and freedom. And that's because they don't think the state should be exercising that level of control over the individual. Now, there are But there's also a place where I'm more libertarian than perhaps some people in certain parts of the US. So, for example, I don't believe in the death penalty, right? And my rationale for it is actually pretty straightforward. I just don't believe the government should kill its citizens. Like, end of story. I don't think we should open that wedge, because then it becomes open to abuse in all kinds of ways. Now, I'm not saying that it is typically abused, and usually you do have a certain independence of the judiciary and so on, and then most people, particularly in the United States, who are executed, I'm sure, are guilty of the crime because you go through 10 years of appeals. But there's not 100% guarantee that that's the case. There'll be always that one person that is, and is it worth killing that one person who is innocent to preserve this? I'm not so sure that it is. Is it a huge additional deterrent to crime? I don't think it is at the extreme levels. Like, so for example, the sorts of crimes for which you would execute someone in Western countries are things like murder and terrorism and things like that, for which you would already have very severe penalties, life imprisonment, that sort of thing. Where I think the death penalty is a deterrent is places like Singapore, where you might be executed for small quantities of drugs, right? You're not going to bring drugs through Singapore. You're just not going to do it because the consequences are so grave relative to the injury caused, right? So the lack of proportionality in the Singaporean system creates an effective deterrent. But most people would disagree with that level of government control, even if the benefit is enormous. We see that in the Philippines with Duterte, who basically allows people to kill drug dealers, right? The local police commissioners have a list of names, and there are bounties of, I think, $400 right, on the heads of these people, completely extrajudicial killings, right? Now, wildly popular actually in Manila, because it does create a culture of fear among criminals, right? That they can just be killed at any time, and so it has suppressed crime. So there is a net benefit for society, but that is at the absolute extreme risk to the sovereignty of the individual. And so that balance always has to be struck, and we strike that balance in different ways, but it is a balance between the individual and the government.
Okay, so then I know this kind of follows a political compass, because there's also like I can't say it. Oh, see you.
See you later.
Authoritarian? Or was that also the state? That refers to
Yeah,
the state?
that is effectively authoritarian versus libertarian. But when I mean libertarian, I mean, it's a fair distinction, right? So you've got this kind of new kind of quad map, which is like authoritarian, libertarian, authoritarian left, authoritarian right, libertarian left, libertarian right. And I'm saying that there is at least one additional axis to that, which is economic left, economic right, cultural left, cultural right. And then you can have your authoritarian and then libertarian on both of those categories. So you can be libertarian on culture, you can be authoritarian on economics. You can be in any space on that map, on the left and the right.
We're gonna have to draw it up for them because I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, no, we can, and we should. We'll hopefully have something on display. It might take a little while for this episode to come out. Hopefully, we'll have some good visuals to explain it. But if I was to be to map myself on this map, it's economically left, culturally right, libertarian when it comes to the sovereignty of the individual, but authoritarian when it comes to the sandbox of legislation, speed limits, drinking limits, that sort of stuff.
Cool.